Welcome to Books with Noah, a podcast where I talk with my friends about their favorite books. Joining me today is Keegan. Keegan is a submarine officer in the Navy Reserve who enjoys reading nonfiction. Today we will be discussing one of his all-time favorite books, The Gene, An Intimate History, by Siddhartha Mukherjee. When not reading, Keegan enjoys hiking, and in May he's going to be beginning the walk of the Pacific Crest Trail, a 2,650-mile journey that will take him from the Mexican border all the way to Canada. His Twitter handle is Keegan Leary, and you can send him audiobook recommendations because he's going to have a long time on that walk. So, welcome to Books with Noah.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate it, Noah. Yeah, I'm looking for, I imagine I'll be listening to a lot of books on that trail. So I've already made it through this one, though, which is pretty long, but I think it's worth the read.
Yeah, you're a man after my own heart. I listened to the book on Audible as well, and it was about 19 hours. And I heard about it from you. I remember asking you what one of your favorite books were, and this was one of them. So how did you hear about the book, and when did you first read or listen to it?
Yeah, so in 2018, there's this Chinese scientist, He Jiankui, I think is how to pronounce it. But he's the guy who essentially used CRISPR editing technology on human embryos to get rid of this gene. It's the CCR5 gene, which is supposed to confer HIV resistance. So in general, I guess a pretty good thing, but the scientific community was pretty up in arms. This guy was all over headlines, and I was kind of embarrassed on my low level of knowledge on the topic. So I found this, I was just reading about different stuff online. I ended up finding this book. And once I started reading it, I couldn't close. It's one of those books I couldn't close. It just is like story after story, interesting fact after interesting fact. So that's how I found it. I originally read it back in 2018, and then here we are 2-3 years later, and I kind of wanted to reread it just because I had talked about it. I've recommended it enough times that I felt like I should know even more kind of what the book is about. I don't commonly reread books, but this is one I felt like this one deserves another read. So yeah.
Yeah, that's high praise. And I will comment on the book structure, right? The author uses these narratives about his family with stories about these diseases kind of interwoven throughout the history of understanding, the gene and genetics and, that story, which is what most of the book is. It's how did we come to know what we know now? And it's fascinating because it's a recent science, right? It's like they knew almost nothing a few hundred years ago. And the book starts out with one of my favorite guys, Pythagoreas, the triangle guy, as other people know him, or if you're a musician, he came up with the 12-tone scale that we have today. So do you want to start us there?
I didn't know he came up with is that like the Western major scale, the 12-tone scale? Or is that
it's the
chromatic scale?
The chromatic scale that you'd have on a piano.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, like when I think about the book, it really starts, he's telling the story of genetics and how we came to discover how inheritance works. And he weaves his own stories in there, but he also starts with Darwin and Mendel. And that Darwin is kind of the macro view of evolution and goes on the HMS Beagle, and just this awesome story that he was considered kind of they call him like a pseudoscientist, or like he's basically a naturalist. He's not a full-fledged scientist. He doesn't quite cut it in the research world.
Yeah, if I can interject real quick, one thing that the author mentioned about both Mendel and Darwin is that they both failed out of medical school and had a really hard time.
Mendel was a failed monk, basically. He was not good on the pulpit, and then he tried to take the exam to become a teacher, and he failed that exam twice. So they're like, here, you can kind of go in this pea garden and cultivate peas. We're trying to produce more agriculture. So he was put in charge of that, and he luckily, he was really good at that. It was very meticulous and tedious, but so I guess his nature, or his kind of, led him to be good at that. So yeah, it starts there, whereas Mendel is the micro view of it, and he comes up with this idea that you have dominant and recessive traits because he would cross different pea plant with pink flower, pea plant with white flower. I don't know if this is exactly the nature of the gene, but one of those is dominant, and the dominant one would show up in the immediate offspring, but in the offspring of the offspring, he would find the recessive came back. So kind of the idea of Punnett squares that we studied probably in what, fifth or sixth grade or something like that, that I was ashamed to have completely forgotten how those work, but this book led me to reconnect with my fifth grade self. So it was great for that. Yeah. And just the other like interesting thing about Mendel is he wrote all his observations down, and then it got published by an obscure journal and just kind of went dormant for 35 years until the 1900s, when his work was rediscovered simultaneously by three different botanists. And they were all like racing to make this discovery, and then they all found out like, oh, Mendel has already done this. So yeah, it just starts out with like a very interesting story like that, which I like. But I'd love to get back to Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem we all know, but this guy was not just thinking about math and music, he was also thinking about why we are the way we are. And that's kind of what most of the people that Siddhartha mentions, they're all trying to answer that question. And so the other names that come up are Plato, and this idea of spermism is that the sperm is like a tiny person, and then it's given to the woman, and the woman provides nutrients. So yeah, the female is the one who nurtures the human form.
But then they started seeing traits from the woman in the child, and then how do you explain women in general, right?
Yeah, and that was Aristotle. Yeah, he was like, he's like, well, this doesn't just have the father's traits; it also has the mother's traits. So yeah, and that's really as far as genetics got until the late 1800s, I guess, and when it kind of started exploding. And that's what's so interesting, is how it exploded, and all the stories behind that. So
Right. One of my favorite parts was that guy in the late 19th century, Weissman, who died in 1914. This guy took like 901 mice and cut all the tails off of the poor mice, and then had them reproduce to see if their descendants would still have tails, to try to test that hypothesis that like, oh, did giraffes grow longer necks by reaching further for the trees? And the answer in this case is a clear no, right? Because all of the descendants had tails. And so I was just amused. It's like, that wasn't that long ago, right? That we had such a low level of knowledge that this is the kind of experiments that people were doing. And now, I mean, you and I were taught this stuff in school, like it was geometry, known for thousands of years.
mm-hmm.
It's a testament to how far we've come.
Yeah, it's very recent. It makes you think like, man, this has got to explode. It's just exploding now. What's it going to be like in another 100 years? So for me, that's kind of why I'm intrigued by this book, is that I think there's going to be an intersection of genetic engineering with computer science that just completely changes the landscape of the world in the next 5 to 10 years, or maybe even sooner. I don't know. I just feel like we think, I call it an explosion right now, but it could blow up even more. Another, like Siddhartha Mukherjee is an expert at analogies, I think, in his book. He compares the cell to a dormant spaceship at one point, and he also compares just genetic discovery to the Manhattan Project, in a lot of places, in the atomic bomb, and how it's just this awesome, destructive, but also destructive force that can be harnessed for good in some in many ways too. So kind of stumbled over describing that. He does a much better job in the book, so that's why you should read the book. But
for sure. Yeah. And it's worth noting he spends a lot of time talking about eugenics, which is a pretty taboo topic because of its tragic history. And he really dives into that in a way that is, I think, important for people today like myself and you. I don't know. I didn't know too much about it other than, of course, the atrocities of, in Germany during World War II and before. But he goes on and he explains that even in the U.S. In the 1920s, and how, it was such a slippery slope of, they started, killing, I guess, deformed infants, right? And then before you knew it, it was, the state was just taking out whoever they wanted, any age. And it's really tragic and sad. But I feel like it's important to have that conversation, and he really digs in and digs deep and gives you a really good idea of the different kinds of things and how different, you know, different governments were able to use science, in quotes, air quotes, to back up whatever their regime wanted, regardless of whether it really was science or not. Like there's this big push for science and pseudoscience just to be able to do whatever you want. And that was a really impactful part of the book for me.
Yeah, he's incredibly diligent about returning every couple chapters to eugenics. I think he calls it like the dark shadow that hangs over genetics at some point in the book. Another way to think about it would be like the evil cousin or the evil stepchild, I don't know, something like that. In that it just walks hand in hand with the great discoveries of genetics. Also has this dark side because it really started with this guy Francis Galton, who was actually Darwin's cousin, and there's probably like a dick measuring contest going on there, and that he was kind of pissed that Darwin was getting all this acclaim. He goes into this pretty good in the book about just all the figures that are trying to come up with these scientific discoveries at that time. And so they were breeding better cattle and better wheat as part of the Industrial Revolution and all this. And so Galton's the guy who says, well, why can't we breed better humans? And it very quickly spiraled into, we don't have to just breed them. We can also cull the herd, to think about, in that we should physically stop people from breeding.
Right. He calls that negative eugenics, which is, sterilization for the most part, as compared with, I guess, positive eugenics, which would be artificially selecting desirable traits. Right.
And he goes very deep into the story of Carrie Buck, who was the first woman to be involuntarily sterilized. Essentially, it's a very strange story. She was diagnosed as an imbecile or feeble-minded was the diagnosis she got. So she just kind of, it essentially was a way to exploit minorities and try to get people that you don't like to not be able to reproduce. And to me, like a big learning thing was that, this actually kind of originated in America with the Better Babies contests. And there was an organization dedicated to eugenics. And there's a moment in the PBS documentary where they do this, where they switch to talking about Hitler and how he was in his prison cell underlining books that were published by this organization. So it's just like, damn, like
a lot there.
Yeah. So it's a lot, definitely, to digest.
Yeah, the story about that lady was really sad. It's kind of like there have been books written about the normal guy who gets stuck in an insane asylum, and like how do you prove that you're not insane? Well, it's pretty much impossible, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're kind of at the mercy of the system. It's tragic.
Yeah, speaking of people who are at the mercy of the system, is you have another story. Watson and Crick are the two names usually associated with discovering the DNA molecule. Yep. And there's this gal, Rosalind Franklin, who took this X-ray picture of DNA, and she didn't get mentioned in the Nobel Prize and all that stuff. So it's again just like a deeper backstory to these amazing discoveries that you just don't get, and another kind of shadow to the genetics movement, I guess. And the other thing about the book, there's one part he puts you in the middle of a conversation between Watson and Crick in a pub in London or somewhere in England, wherever they were. And it just felt really cool. I was like, oh man, I feel like I'm kind of here, however he writes is just so well done. And I was just, as I'm reading, I'm underlining all this stuff, and I'm underlining way too much here. Anyways, so.
Yeah, there's so much in there. And it blew my mind how he talks through these chapters, how they discovered DNA, right? Like before they even discovered DNA, they had discovered that, okay, there's some kind of mechanism for storing this information, and they didn't know what it was or how it was, right? And I thought that was fascinating. And so Watson and Crick is kind of like this mind-blowing moment. It's like, okay, this is the thing. This is where it is. We knew it was there as a concept. And they talk about that guy Mueller who discovered that he could X-ray his flies and create genetic mutations, and that was like such a big deal. That kind of pointed to that. This information is stored in us or in living things, and we can actually change it. And I thought that was I was like, wow, that's cool and that's recent.
Yeah, and you can't help but think like, okay, if it's just information, then it's like a computer, right? How are we like computers, or how am I, just a piece of information? And when you think that way, then you immediately start to think, well, how can you engineer this thing, and how, what changes can you make? And that's the second part of the book dives into that a lot. He starts with how we started with synthetic insulin, kind of an amazing story there, and then there was the Human Genome Project, which was the goal to sequence the whole human genome. And as they're doing that, then a private company steps into the game, and the guy who was the CEO of the private company, um, I forget his name. The company's name is Solera, but anyways, it doesn't matter. He was pretty outspoken in the news and just basically saying like the Human Genome Project is kind of a sham, but so it like really got the public interested in the sequencing of the human genome. So in a sense, like that, the battle that they were having was good for the science of genetics because people were paying attention.
Yeah, that's right. He talks about how, there was that lady who had that obscure disease and she's, finding other people and then they, are able to get their stuff, you know, they're able to find it in the genome and just all sorts of stories like that. It's so cool. Makes you really wonder about the future. And then the end of the book is about the modern part of genetics, right? The genome project, like you mentioned, other kind of gene therapies that they're trying, and then still the modern day eugenics stuff is coming back a bit, right? It's more from the positive side. What tinkering are we going to allow people to do, and what's ethical, what's not, and that's a even without the sterilization part of the problem, that's still a very difficult argument to have.
Hmm. At the end of the book, he provides a 13-point manifesto and a triangle of thought, which the vertices of the triangle I don't remember right now, but it's a good way of like he's saying like, okay, how do we as a humanity decide what's okay to genetically engineer and what's not? Because we obviously decided that editing human embryos right now is not okay. The
Yeah, the
gal
push.
who discovered CRISPR, or is credited with the discovery, Jennifer Doudna, she's the one who was pushing to put a moratorium on gene editing in human embryos in the first place. So yeah, I don't even think all the scientists know, what they want to do with it and what they should. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
it
the future has many questions, I feel like.
does. And the road to hell is paved with unintended consequences, right? Like they talk about how there's so many genes that have multiple functions and how things are very complicated, right? And so you could make one change and who knows if that's the only change you've made and what happens. But I got to say, I thought it was a fantastic book, and he does a good job really working out all of the nuance and all of these ideas.
Yeah, something like as I was reading it, I was thinking, okay, let's say I basically came to the book saying I want to learn more about genetics. And the other style to do it is to pick up a genetics textbook or take a genetics course online, right? And to me, the way this book is written is flip. It's reverse of how you would get it in a textbook. A textbook, here's the building block. Here's the nucleic acid. Here's DNA structure. Here's the protein. Here's the mechanism, transcription, translation. Here's all the mechanisms. And you spend 25, 30 pages memorizing these things. And then there's questions in the back. And stuffed between that 30 pages of content and the 3 pages of difficult questions is a little blue blurb that says, oh, by the way, this is how DNA was discovered. And yeah, I think Mr. Mukherjee basically flips that and just makes it so much more pleasant to learn about the topic. I don't know the specific mechanisms, I guess, all the details that if I were to pass some sort of exam, but that's fine for me. This book was just fun to read. So
Completely. Well, Keegan, thank you for being part of Books with Noah.
yeah, thanks for having me. Always happy to be reading books and want to know what's the next one. He actually has another book that I think he's more well known for about cancer because he's a um, cancer researcher, cancer doctor, oncologist, whatever. That supposedly is very good too. So I got to add that one to my list.
Thanks for listening to Books with Noah. Please visit our website, bookswithnoah.com. You can also find us on YouTube by searching Books with Noah.